Hey,
Hello,
George.
John.
I'm here and you're there.
Hi, John.
And this is Blogging Heads TV.
Yes,
Science Saturday.
with John
With-
Horgan and...
George Johnson. In Garrison, New York, and...
Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Wow, it's almost like we practiced that.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. So what have you
Hey,
been
George.
up to?
Oh, just... I don't know, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But I've got sort of a touchy question I wanted to ask you.
Oh, okay.
In times of calamity and crisis, do you ever secretly get, or maybe not so secretly, get exhilarated?
Oh, you mean like having this real perverse desire that the economy is actually going to collapse?
Yeah. Or
yeah, totally.
But it's not, so I want to distinguish this from Schadenfreude.
Yeah.
So it's not, I mean, I actually have money in the market.
Oh, yeah, I do too.
You know, I've got my 401k and the money that we need to put our kids through college.
Oh,
But,
yeah, we all do now, since we've all been convinced that your average investor is supposed to be invested in the stock market instead of doing what my father always did and buy certificates of deposit from the local bank.
Yeah, your dad is looking like a genius right now.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
No, it's a funny feeling. You know, it's, I think most people don't like to admit to these feelings, but I think there's something sort of profound about it. It's, yeah, do you know, did you ever read Walker Percy, the novelist?
Yeah.
Do you remember, so his greatest novel, I think, was The Moviegoer.
Oh, The Moviegoer is wonderful. Binks, was that the guy's name?
Yeah,
in,
something.
New Orleans?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
he's this sort of disaffected, he's a stockbroker, actually, as I
That's
recall.
right. That would be a good thing to reread now. That was
And
actually one of
there-
my real formative novels. I really identified with Binks.
Well, he was sort of depressed and, you know, always sort of had this lurking sense of the meaninglessness of life.
Yeah.
And I think he was in love with a woman who was even more melancholy than he was. I forget her name. But there was this amazing scene in the beginning of the book where he's taking out some beautiful woman, and he's driving out somewhere on this date, and he's feeling depressed because everything seems so predictable.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as I recall, they get into an automobile accident,
Yeah.
and then he feels this strange exhilaration, even though it's a real pain in the ass. You know,
Yeah.
it sort of screwed up his plans, and his car was damaged. But he realized that it was just, you know, something happened.
Something
to
happened.
knock him out of
Yeah.
out of his enemy, you know, the sort
Yeah,
of
you're
rush that he
shocked
was
out of your just normal slumber, and then just forced to confront the world in this real direct way.
Yeah,
Yeah, very existential.
very existential. So, you know, ordinarily there's anxiety that goes along often with that sort of process of being knocked out of your normal modes of thinking and behaving, but then there also can be this funny
Yeah.
excitement that you feel at the same
Yeah,
time.
you get so comfortable, and you're afraid to take any risks. You're afraid something will happen, and then you realize you can just be sitting around minding your own business, not taking any risks that you know you're taking anyway, and then suddenly, wham! The
Right.
floor's pulled out from under you. The whole economy collapses, and we're back to the Stone Age. And I guess there's part of it's the exhilarating thought of starting all over from scratch and having this adjustment of people's values to be confronted with what's real, and the idea of making money from actually making things, or
Yeah.
or at least performing real services that are related to making things, as opposed to all these like 10 levels of abstraction above what any real value, like with all these complex financial instruments. That's such a great phrase, complex financial instrument. It's just always bandied about in all these stories, and basically it's saying that we don't know what they are, so we will just call them complex financial instruments.
Bundled risks.
Yeah.
bundled
Right.
probabilities.
Double
yeah,
reverse, mortgage-backed, leveraged somethings.
Well, I guess maybe there is a little Schadenfreude. Is that right? Schadenfreude?
Yeah,
Whatever.
I never say it. I only read it. But
Well,
taking comfort and joy in other people's suffering.
I mean, so there are no more arrogant sons of bitches out there than these Wall Street financial titans who run the big investment banks, and seeing them humiliated in the way that they have been, and exposed as being just really no smarter than the rest of us. Although, of course, the problem is that they're still going to walk away with a buttload of money.
Yeah, most of them. There was an interesting profile of someone. It was an anonymous profile, and I don't know if it was fictionalized or not. It wasn't supposed to have been, but it was describing a trader, I guess, head of a trading department at Lehman Brothers, and just all of his thoughts and anguishes going through all this. And then somewhere in the article they were quoting someone else anonymously who was, considering whether she should break up with her fiancé because, he had been destroyed financially, and they were going into their marriage with millions of dollars in, paper assets, and now they were just wiped out. And she says, we only have like $200,000 in the bank.
Well, if you're living in Manhattan, really, that ain't much.
No, I know, but,
Other people are the vast majority of people around the world are not going to be sympathetic.
No. I mean, it's scary, but at the same time, I know what you mean. And it's not so much wanting people to get their comeuppance for all this extravagance, although there is that. But then just this idea that, maybe a really seismic shock like this, to use another cliche, with these complex financial instruments all unraveling, will maybe shock society into, like some kind of new mode or new state that'll be, closer to the ground in reality.
Yeah, well, that would be nice to think so. I guess.
I mean, there's all kinds of things about, that were great about having all these excesses in the economy and this bubble and, creating all this wealth. And to some degree, we all probably benefited from it. But, then when it collapses, it just makes you think, maybe this is time to, just reconfigure things. Well, I mean, if that happens, they will reconfigure themselves. But, I thought that was going to happen after the shock of 9/11. And, within a year or two, we'd absorbed it into the system and kind of discounted it. And I suspect that's what will happen with this.
Our shallowness and greed and materialism runs very deep.
Well,
deep
is there a part of
shallowness.
you that I find myself thinking this sometimes, and this is really kind of stupid, but that it might be really kind of cool to have to go through something like the Great Depression. Not cool, but the experience of really having to think about survival and maybe growing vegetables in the backyard, not because it's fun to do, but because you really need to do this. And
yeah, well, this reminds me of
I say that and I immediately feel really stupid saying it because, people really suffered during the Great Depression. But on the other hand, they had these, it brings this kind of directness to life that I think that Binks and the moviegoer was longing for.
Well, George, you and I, it's often occurred to me that we are in this very sort of esoteric kind of a luxury, unnecessary economic niche.
Well, yeah, I mean, talk about getting money for not producing things of substance.
Yeah.
I mean, we're basically paid to move around little symbols, and actually, when you really get down to it, the physical level, basically, we're being paid to rearrange magnetic domains on hard disks into different patterns in response to other patterns that come into us as input. So
I think of us as being just the lowest paid and least respected members of the entertainment industry.
Yeah, but surely there's value in if not educating people, at least exposing people to ideas and to trying to make sense of things for your readers. And
I guess so, but that
really
really
good
is
economic journalists right now are, some of them are doing some really impressive work. Sometimes it makes me think, like, why did I want to spend my life doing things like trying to explain quantum mechanics when, I should be spending it complaining mortgage-backed securities.
I don't know. I think economic reporting, I don't know it that well. I try to avoid it if I can. My sense is that they go through the same process that science journalists go through of building up people in the financial industry in their case, in science in our case, and then tearing them down. So, hyping something and then debunking it.
Well, it's just kind of the normal cycle of journalism.
Yeah. But so I would like to know how many of the business journalists who are now saying that you could foresee this disaster were really prescient and weren't sort of touting some of this buildup of the
guy
real
who
estate
invented
market.
the whole, the economics behind mortgage-backed securities and chopping up and distributing risk got the Nobel Prize in economics, and was just hailed for years as having allowed more and more people to buy homes and to increase the percentage of home ownership in the country by coming up with this wonderful new source of mortgage money. So.
Well, somebody told me that the Village Voice recently had an article tracing the subprime crisis to Andrew Cuomo when he was head of the, whatever it's called, the housing department under the Clinton administration in the late 1990s, as an act of compassion and sort of classic liberal economics. He encouraged banks to relax some of their restrictions for low-income would-be home buyers.
Yeah.
And then the under the Bush administration, bankers just ran with that, and it exploded into this very high-risk financial market.
Yeah,
and that's
I guess
what
that was
led to
part of it. I mean, I hadn't heard that factor, but you still have to combine this whole magic of mortgage-backed securities where you're chopping up each loan into and distributing it among all these different instruments, and then having instruments that are based on the instruments, and piling up all these different levels of abstraction and risk. And I don't know, it's just the whole thing is just so baffling in some ways. That article that you referred to me on edge.org by what's his name, Taleb, the guy who wrote The Black Swan?
Yeah, Nassim Nicholas Taleb.
Yeah, now I really want to read that book. I found the article, I didn't understand it at all. No, I don't mean to say at all. I didn't understand all of it, but it kind of gave me a sense of what might be going on that I didn't have before. And
he's got some great metaphors in this. So this is a guy.
Let's back up and say who he is.
Right. He was a Wall Street quant, and now he's described as he's actually a professor at NYU Polytechnic, and he's a distinguished professor of risk engineering.
Yeah, risk engineering.
Yeah, essayist and former mathematical trader. And I was just talking to a friend of mine this morning who knows a lot about Wall Street. And he said that this guy, when he was a trader, actually made a lot of money. And he's retired now because, I have no idea if this is true, but this is what my friend said.
Yeah.
And, so now he's sort of a finance intellectual, but he's got out of the actual business of making money. But his point in this is that there is this really pervasive inability to accurately assess risk in the markets, and especially to assess the impact of what he calls black swans. These are anomalous events. So it refers to this philosophical idea. Sort of ordinary induction tells you see 1,000 swans, they're all white, therefore you can conclude that all swans are white.
Right.
Until all of a sudden, there's the black swan.
Right. Wasn't that Bertrand Russell?
Okay.
Was that who originally used this metaphor?
No idea. I think Thomas Kuhn used it in Structure of Scientific Revolution.
I think it goes back before that, though. But anyway, so, yeah, and he gave this great example of the Thanksgiving turkey.
Right.
Where he shows a chart where every day the turkey is provided with food by the farmer over 1,000 days or almost 3 years, and naturally, comes to conclude based on the past that the world is a very wonderful, benevolent place, and that there's always food available, and that people thrive. And then on the 1,000th day, of course, they chop his head off and eat him.
Right.
What struck me was this idea that we know that as they always say on the mutual fund prospectuses, that past performance is no guarantee of future performance. But we assume that there's going to be anomalies and things you can't predict. That there's going to be the 1,000-year flood and the 100-year flood. But I guess his point is these anomalous events, rare as they are, if they do happen, they are just so utterly devastating that the fact that they're rare is just completely washed out by their severity. And one would be the turkey getting his head chopped off, and the rest would be all of us other turkeys having our 401ks devastated because of this anomalous event that couldn't have happened in more than 1 in 10,000 years, except here it came.
Well, he actually says, I find this hard to believe, but I assume the guy knows what he's talking about, that the market just lost more money over the last, I'm not sure what the time...
Or the banks.
Period, all the banks, than they have made in history. Yeah,
I think he was referring to the banks. So basically all the money that they've earned over the years, basically, paying 3% on your savings account and then loaning it out at 6% for a car loan. All these little gains they've eked out, they basically lost it. They lost way more than they ever earned on this one really bad bet on this.
Right. Yeah. 1,000 financial institutions. It includes, Fannie Mac. Is that Fannie Mac? Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers. That they just lost $1 trillion.
Yeah.
And that is more than their net profits.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what's so striking in this idea about, he refers to the two different worlds. One is called Mediocristan and one is called Extremistan.
Right.
And in Mediocristan, you basically get Gaussian kind of distributions and bell curves where, things kind of muddle along in the normal way, and then occasionally something happens out on the edge of the bell curve. There's going to be anomalies. But when these anomalies happen, it's not that big a deal when they're easily absorbed. And, one example he gives is if you take the heaviest human being on Earth and say, add that person to a list of 1,000 average human beings, the average weight will not significantly go up because it's basically, the anomaly is washed out by, this big fat bell curve. While in Extremistan, you get these extreme situations that happen, these anomalies, and yet they are just so powerful that they just blow everything away.
Yeah, one of the analogies that he used that made this clearer for me, because I like you, I found parts of this a little bit difficult to understand, and I've always tried to...
It wasn't terribly well written.
Well,
it started out well, but I think it could have used some editing, but I probably wrote it pretty quickly, considering, we're writing a $700 billion bailout plan in 3 days, so we probably felt like
it's pretty up to date.
It really makes me want to read the book, which I've heard is just wonderful.
But he says that a lot of economic models are based on these sort of artificial systems that are analogous to gambling casinos.
Yeah.
So you can calculate the probability of blackjack or roulette or some of these, these games of chance, and you have a completely bounded system.
Yeah.
So there are there are unusual events. You can get 21 a bunch of times in a row, or keep getting the same number in roulette, but that still falls within mediocristan.
Yeah,
because
it obviously
overall,
works. You just have to go to the Las Vegas Strip and see all the opulence and the architecture, and clearly
right.
they're using statistics and probability to the benefit of the house.
The unpredictability is extremely predictable.
Right.
When you move to the real world, it's almost as though, let's say you're playing craps, you're throwing dice. So normally you've got a range from 2 to 12.
Yeah.
Well, in the real world, it's like every now and then you roll the dice and you get 627.
Yeah.
Instead of somewhere between 2 and 12. And he says that the economic models consistently ignore that possibility, that you get these things that are way off.
Yeah,
the
so it's
normal
almost like if you're sitting there rolling dice and it turns out that if you get snake eyes that they explode and kill you.
Right, yeah.
And maybe they form a black hole like people were worried about at the LHC, and they suck everything in and destroy the universe.
Yeah, because of course this applies even more to international affairs and politics and things like that, where basically his thesis comes down to shit happens. So this reminds me of
and how do we live in a world that we really don't understand, and what's really makes him so righteously angry, and these were some of the best parts of the article, is how these people in Wall Street were pretending that they understood the risks, and they were basically using what they'd learned in mediocristan and applying it to extremistan, and that way they could justify on paper these investments. And
yeah, he really goes after Ben Bernanke.
Yeah, right.
Bernanke, whatever it is, and who was who took over as chairman of the Federal Reserve after Alan Greenspan, and so Taleb says that he's a perfect example of the turkey, who is just saying, well, look, things are going fine. It's like getting fatter every day. Life is good, and assuring all the other turkeys that everything is cool.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, all the heads are cut off.
Right.
This reminds me of, I thought a classic example of a black swan took place in 1995, and I remember I had been, I was actually trying to finish my first book, The End of Science, and I had this whole chapter on chaos and complexity, which were dealing with unpredictable systems. And there was this bank, one of the oldest and most respected banks in England, was called Barings.
Yeah.
And there was this trader named Nick Leeson, who started, I guess, kind of on his own. He was very aggressively trading some kind of futures, and he was sort of doing the classic gambler's gambit of, he started losing, and he just keeps doubling his investment because he thought sooner or later he had to get a return, and he would get back all his losses. And actually, there was quite a bit of logic given the history.
If you have infinite resources, you can do that.
And do you remember what happened to him?
No.
He started really going deeply into Asian markets, and that's where he put his final huge bet on. And then the Kobe earthquake hit. So there's this huge earthquake in Kobe, Japan, and it sent the markets in Japan and then throughout Asia into a tailspin. Mm-hmm. And so that was the last straw, where he lost everything. He couldn't recover, and Barings Bank, they had losses of over $1 billion and went down. That was, Barings Bank.
Yeah. So if you're in the casino and you're losing and you have an infinite amount of chips to play with, you can keep doubling, and then eventually you'll prevail more
Yeah.
likely than not. But on the other hand, you may do this so long that an earthquake will destroy the casino.
Right. A meteorite will strike, or God knows what.
Well, another thing,
power outage.
You mentioned that you were writing this chapter on complexity, and I think a lot of what Taleb's talking about is related to what they call criticality in systems that like the old sand pile thing with the power law describing the earthquake. So if you have a sand pile and you analyze it mathematically, basically you can show that there's going to be a whole lot of little tiny landslides, but occasionally there's going to be one really huge big landslide, and extinction events are like this, and it's basically you have a system that reaches this point of criticality, and it seems to be related also to having a lack of redundancy in the system. So there's this guy that he cites, Barbassi, that I've interviewed before, that has done these studies like of the electrical grid, the Americans, the U.S. electrical grid, and there's apparently so little redundancy in this system, and another word for it is that it's optimized, to the point where there's no redundancy. And, therefore you can have catastrophic failures. While you could make it less optimal and have more redundancy built into the system, like with the Internet, and which has that kind of redundancy because it wasn't really planned from the top down. It kind of grew from the bottom up to a large extent. So you're not going to get those kind of critical events.
That was an interesting argument. So he said that in biology we have quite a bit of redundancy, which makes biological system quite robust. And he actually used the sex drive as an example of that. So he said that sexual activity tends to be highly redundant. So we don't mammals. Well, let's just stick with humans. Many of them tend to be horny, pretty much all the time, at least in certain periods of their lives, much more than they need to reproduce. But this perpetual horniness ensures that there's a greater likelihood of reproduction and enough offspring to perpetuate.
Yeah, and just the robustness of life. Like if you've ever tried to kill like a really obnoxious tree, a weed tree, like a Siberian elm.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible. I mean, you can cut them down, and that doesn't work. And then I've cut them down. I've dug holes in them, with a chainsaw, poured all kinds of horrible poisons in them, and then next spring they'll come back. There's just enough little redundancy in the system. But with these financial, with the current crisis, I guess his argument was there was no redundancy in the system. It was like optimized to the hilt. I mean, optimized is a funny word because it has this positive connotation, but basically it means there was no slack in the system because they were squeezing out every bit that they could, and then you got into this critical state where you got the earthquake, the landslide.
I see Taleb as part of this tradition of emphasizing the noise in systems we're trying to understand. So what scientists are generally trying to do is come up with models that allow you to predict the behavior of a system and extract laws and general principles from the apparent chaos of nature. But then there's some scientists who really seem to take pleasure in pointing out the limits of our models and our laws and general principles that allow us understanding. So this guy obviously loves it. Another person who I think, whose whole career was dedicated to saying that shit happens in biology and evolution was Stephen Jay Gould. I mean, I think of him as being sort of the great emphasizer of noise in the system of biology. Whereas, his arch nemesis, Richard Dawkins, was somebody who obsessively focused on the orderliness of nature.
Yeah.
And of course you've got both, but each just thought that their focus was more appropriate.
Yeah. I always found Gould's position, whatever you want to call it, really attractive, and especially in his book Wonderful Life.
Yeah.
And the notion of rewinding the tape and some minor little perturbation at the beginning of the of life on Earth. You rewind the history of life on Earth and replay it, and some tiny little jot or twiddle, I think he called it, at the beginning, and we're not here or anything like us.
Yeah.
Just all the contingency in the system, and a lot of people don't like that and have very, very powerful arguments against it philosophically. But I really, really like that idea. I guess it's the same reason I like the idea that the universe is just here because of a fluke and not because we have to explain that there's some reason that the initial conditions of the universe were just so that they gave rise to such amazing people as us.
Yeah, I think this is one of the real flaws in the worldview of our friend and sponsor Bob Wright, is that he doesn't appreciate just luck enough.
Yeah. Well, he wrote a devastating attack on Gould's Wonderful Life. I guess it was in the form of a book review in the New Republic. I mean, years and years ago when the book came out. And
yeah, there's another great scientist. I should probably put quotes around the great, because it had been said of him sometimes that he won a Nobel Prize on the smallest merit of any scientist in history.
Who's that?
Ilya Prigogine, the great complexity theorist.
Yeah.
So he was a Belgian physicist who then became this kind of iconic figure in chaos and then complexity. And he actually wrote a book called The End of Certainty. That was one of his last books. I think it came out in the late 1990s, where he thought that all of science was, the sort of determinism that had ruled science, especially from Newton on, was dissolving and giving way to a much more sort of fluid, probabilistic understanding of how nature works.
Yeah.
So I see him also as very much sort of in the same general category as Taleb and Steve Gould, emphasizing the noisiness of systems, the limits of knowledge, and so forth, the limits of certainty.
And then one of Taleb's points seems to be that doesn't mean you can't still make a fair amount of money.
Yeah, right.
You engage in redundancy. You don't, bet the house on one thing. You don't have to, if you're driven to optimize the system and squeeze out every bit that you perceive as possible, then you're risking, losing more than you win. But if you make, some fairly little conservative bets and, cash out early and don't go too far out and always keep a good cushion, you can, which I suspect is what he did. If your friend is right that, he really prospered when he was on Wall Street.
Well, and you also try to find out what's going on in the real world instead of becoming obsessed with your mathematical models.
Well, yeah, that was another interesting point, that so many of these people who are using these mathematical models just, it's basically like you order them from, the Sears Roebuck catalog. You just get these packages and you use them, and you maybe sort of understand them, but not in any deep way.
Yeah, I mean, you can still find out, you meet a couple of guys who've got this software package that looks like it's really good at finding keywords and linking to websites on the internet, and you invest in that, and it becomes Google, and you make yourself a fortune because you recognize that it was a really great idea.
Well, yeah, you can always, you can make a model, that will justify anything. We see that a lot here in the Southwest, where whenever some developer wants to put in a new subdivision, you can find a hydrologist who will come up with a complex hydrological model predicting that there's enough water under the ground to support so many thousand people for 100 years.
Right.
And, but you could just as easily come up with another model that says that, you're going to be courting disaster to build this development, and we're going to, end up lining up with jerry cans in the street to fill them up from National Guard water trucks. And it seems like it was the same with these financial models. There was a good piece by, I'm blanking on his name. He's one of the technology reporters at the Times, who does the Bits blog.
Joe Nocera?
No, it wasn't Joe Nocera. Someone on staff. I should know his name. But anyway, I'll find the link later so we can put it up. But he wrote a really good piece talking to some of his friends who had gone into Wall Street, I guess, instead of business journalism about these models, and just the extent to which they're based on wishful thinking. And you can come up with a model that will justify what you're doing, but there's going to be an infinite number of other models that would predict something else. A whole range of them, and just how people get into this mindset of oh yeah, this is the model we want, and then you believe the model, and it sort of becomes this talisman for kind of a group hallucination. Well,
and of course, if you can just play the system, and if you just get out in time, you don't believe too much in your model. You're just assuming that other people will believe in it, and you're just playing that mob psychology. And a lot of the big players on Wall Street just have a way of getting out before the crash, or they've got their golden parachutes, so they can afford to take those big risks.
Well, that's another thing. Yeah, I mean, presumably a lot of these people have so much money, socked away like real money. They probably have gold bullion in their basement, and in Connecticut.
I'm telling you, George, we're getting to the point where it's not going to be gold bullion and jewels or cash. It's going to be ammo and canned food
wow,
and
what
water.
An optimist. Well, gold too. The value of gold is based. It's a mass hallucination. It's an agreement to put value in this shiny metal that you can make jewelry with.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't need gold. I need a shotgun and a big crate of shells.
Well, and petroleum and oils and energy sources, plutonium.
Plutonium.
Put your money in plutonium and keep it in a lead-lined vault. Yeah, I don't know. So you're kind of getting this perverse sort of sense of glee, like maybe you'll actually be storing ammo in the basement and putting up a perimeter fence around your property there with your brave dog, and keeping out hordes of marauding unemployed Wall Street bond traders from coming in.
Glee is probably too strong.
Killing your birds
and this is offset by the fact that I have kids, and I'm hoping that the world remains reasonably stable for them as they go to college and start out in their careers. I don't want this to be like that last novel of Cormac McCarthy, where we're roaming around trying to avoid cannibals. But I wanted to bring up. Actually, there's one other thing. I hesitate to bring this up because it's not. Well, you'll see what I mean when I say it. But the time when I felt this sensation, it was almost more of an aesthetic sensation than sort of happiness, and kind of a scales falling from the eyes effect, was on 9/11, which you talked about before.
Yeah.
And that was such a shocking event. It was as though you realize you normally walk around sort of in this cocoon of assumptions and expectations, and then on that day it was just ripped away.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was definitely this horror. I think I've told you before that we can see the Manhattan skyline from a hill right near our property, and it was though for the rest of that day it was as though I was seeing things for the first time. It was like
this clarity.
The world was reborn in this kind of terrible way, and everything was in very sharp relief.
Yeah.
And it was almost this kind of mystical sensation, and I think that's what. So it's not even sort of something as concrete as looking forward to having fun after the end of civilization, and defending your family in some kind of primeval way. It was really just seeing things, having the sensation of seeing things more directly than we normally do.
Yeah. I'm trying to find a great quote from Ken Kesey, of all people, about that really struck me. It was, it was something that Kesey apparently sent in an email to friends, and then it got circulated around, and describing 9/11. And he said, "Everything was so clear that day, so unencumbered by theories and opinions, by thought even. It just was."
Yeah.
Yeah, that just really struck me. And also the sense of hope that this really was going to be the end of irony, or it was going to be the end of partisan politics and petty political campaigns that are based on marketing and advertisement instead of honesty and ideas and sincerity. And I really hope that. And then you just watched over the next few weeks or months as it all just sort of went back to normal. And it struck me, the metaphor that struck me was hysteresis in physics. You have a system, and it's like inertia. It's inertia in a system where you can perturb it beyond where it normally goes, but then it's going to kind of slowly it's going to slowly return itself to a stable point. It's used a lot to describe like electrical systems involving transformers and magnetic fields, and you can jolt them into some extreme, and then they settle back down because they have this kind of dynamic inertia that's called hysteresis. So I actually wrote something about that I'll try to find and post.
It reminds me also, there's a psychiatrist who's written about mystical experiences. I think his name is Arthur Diekman. I mentioned him somewhere in my last book.
Yeah.
And he's talked about these two effects that normally kind of wrap us in this perceptual cocoon. I think he calls them automatization, and instrumentality. So instrumentality, the notion is that we're sort of always goal-oriented. So there's something that we have to do, or we want to get, some task that we have to fulfill, and we're always sort of thinking in those terms. And automatization is the notion that we're always trying to learn how to do things efficiently, so we don't really have to think about doing them. We can sort of be on automatic pilot. So these two cognitive tendencies combine to make us just kind of like robots, just sort of going about our daily business and fulfilling these tasks. And he said every now and then something happens, and what 9/11 has in common with some other effects that can make this happen is a sudden awareness of your mortality, a confrontation with death, and with sort of the fact that there's this infinite space around us and eternity around us, and then you're reminded of that for just moments, and it's not a comfortable feeling usually, but it can be exhilarating as well. I guess that's what
speaking about kind of doing things on automatic pilot and just going about, I described to you before our conversation how this camera that they sent me keeps going into this mode where it goes on automatic zoom. And while you were doing that, you were giving that really great monologue there. It did just that, and it zoomed in on my bookshelf behind my head and focused in on a copy of Chaos by James Glick.
Oh, that's great.
Oh, now it's doing it again. So partly I mentioned this so people don't think I was not listening to that great... I was actually trying to fix the camera by putting a piece of tape over the zoom button, but
I just have to mention,
this.
There's one other figure who Atala brings up in this essay I wanted to mention, because I've had sort of an interesting run-in with him in the past, is Benoit Mandelbrot.
Oh, sure, yeah. He really admires Mandelbrot, because he's basically saying that while the bell curve applies to Mediocristan, it's really Mandelbrot's fractals that best describe Extremistan.
Yeah, so, Mandelbrot was somebody who, he was a mathematician at IBM, I think, going back to the late 50s, early 60s, and he started exploring power law distributions and showing that they really described a vast number of phenomena, including the behavior of financial markets.
Right.
And then he came up with these mathematical structures called fractals, which also showed power law behavior. And the notion of a fractal, the term, refers to the fact that instead of it being a one-dimensional figure or a two-dimensional figure, it's got a fractional dimension, because it's an object whose borders are infinitely fuzzy. Mm-hmm. So you can't really find the precise border. If you keep zooming in on any detail of a fractal structure, you keep finding more and more detail at infinitely great depths.
Right.
And there's this similarity of the pattern that you see at all different scales.
Yeah.
And so the classic example of this is something that's called the Mandelbrot set, which is this object that it was very famous back in the 80s after Glick wrote his book, Chaos. In fact, Mandelbrot was one of the heroes of Glick's book. It sort of looks like a figure 8 lying on its side with little warts all over it.
Yeah.
And,
it's a real acid trip.
Yeah.
And then if you look at one dynamic, where you zoom into it and keep seeing the same structure replicated at all these scales. And I think Glick may have been the first person to really do a popular profile of Mandelbrot. And
actually, I think the person who really broke the story of the Mandelbrot set was a columnist for Scientific American named Key Dewdney.
Oh, yeah, A.K. Dewdney.
And so I don't think it was a profile of Mandelbrot, but it was a description of the set and its properties, and it was sort of like a condensed version of Mandelbrot's great book, which made him kind of a cult figure, The Fractal Geometry of Nature.
And he did, some interesting stuff on cellular automata as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Game of Life. He was really good.
It seems like he did a lot of interesting computer science stuff, and before a lot of people realized that computer science is so interesting. Right. Besides computer scientists, I mean.
But the interesting thing about Mandelbrot was that he was, there was this kind of tension in his work that I think has persisted in Chaos and Complexity, that he's looking at these apparently noisy systems, and he's saying, underneath this noise, there's this order that can be described with these very simple formulas. So the Mandelbrot set, the basic formula was incredibly simple. It was, you've got z squared plus z, z squared plus c. Z and c are complex numbers, so that's an imaginary number, which is, it's the square root of a negative number. Mm-hmm. And so those are called imaginary numbers, and combined with a real number, and you just iterate this. So you calculate, you put some numbers into those variables, and then you calculate it, and then you keep plugging that back into the formula, and you plot it on a graph, and that's how you get this bizarre structure.
Recursion.
Set. Right.
Yeah, and it's the same phenomenon you see with the cellular automata, with the little grids, like in the Game of Life, where you can start with certain patterns and apply the same simple little rule to it over and over recursively, and then you get this this blossoming of complexity sometimes.
Well, so I actually did a story.
Here it goes
So
again.
Mandelbrot first described the Mandelbrot set in 1979, and showed pictures of it that he generated on a computer. And in 1990, while I was at Scientific American, I got a story. I think it broke in the Hartford Courant on how a couple of mathematicians at the University of Connecticut had published an image of the Mandelbrot set before Mandelbrot did.
Oh.
And this was becoming a little sort of tempest in a teapot thing, so I thought it'd be really sort of fun to do a story about the, who really discovered the Mandelbrot set.
Oh, so the claim was that these people had scooped him and published first?
Yeah,
Oh.
and then Mandelbrot never gave them credit for it.
Well, did he know about them?
He did know about them. I discovered that in my reporting, but he thought that their result was trivial, that they didn't recognize the profound importance of the Mandelbrot set in particular, or fractals in general. And so I did this story, and then there were people who were pointing out that actually there were mathematicians as early as there was a guy named Pierre Fatou who described Julia sets, which are very similar to the Mandelbrot set, in the early 1900s.
Yeah.
And so my story all became sort of about how there's almost this fractal nature to scientific discovery, in that when you bore in on the details, it's not, it's never linear or simple, where you just sort of have this discovery de novo, that there are always predecessors. There's always some kind of foundational work. But anyway, eventually I had to call Mandelbrot to tell him I was working on a story about who discovered the Mandelbrot set.
Yeah.
And he's famously big-egoed, shall we say.
Oh, yeah.
And
I've heard that.
He flipped out. He got so angry that he didn't want to answer any of these questions. He basically said, "How dare you write this story?"
Yeah.
He said, "Do you realize that my book is like one of the best-selling books of Freeman Press, which is the publishing arm of Scientific American? I'm a big money maker for them. You better drop this story. You're going to be in big trouble, buddy."
Oh, no.
And
I mean, I can see him being upset if he, in what may have been righteous indignation, but to make that kind of petty threat is...
Oh, he followed through on it, too. He actually ended up talking to my publisher. But
Really?
I did the story anyway. My editor backed me
Did they
up.
respond to this?
It ultimately was Jonathan Peele's decision. He was my editor at the time, and he said he backed me up. I really felt good about Jonathan for having my back on it. So I published this piece, which I'm still really proud of, because as I said, it wasn't just trying to belittle Mandelbrot's achievement, which is great. He's a brilliant, incredibly imaginative mathematician who was maligned by other so-called pure mathematicians because he was at IBM and he was sort of more into applied mathematics and was interested in computer science at a time when mathematicians were sort of disdainful of computer science in the 1970s.
Yeah, that's an
1980s.
interesting cultural thing, how mathematics was divided between, really there was the mainstream, which was, the real continuous mathematics, and then the discrete mathematics of computer science.
Yeah, and now they're really fused, except for a few Luddite holdouts, I guess.
Yeah.
But back then it was still pretty novel. But anyway, Mandelbrot was just he just didn't want this to be done. Here, I've even got a picture of the original picture of the Mandelbrot set. Let me see if I can.
Yeah, hold it up. That'll be good.
That's the original, the first depiction of the Mandelbrot set, computer-generated, produced by these two mathematicians in Connecticut in 1978, 1 year before Mandelbrot published his version of the set.
A
little bit of mathematical history.
Well, I'd like to read this article. I don't think I saw it when it came out.
Yeah, a long time ago. 18
well, yeah, I may
years
have
ago.
forgotten
Jesus.
it.
So,
Yeah, and it was, and to get back to Taleb again, obviously this piece on Edge was really food for thought or something. But I know, he mentioned Mandelbrot sets and fractals and power laws where you have a rare number of extreme events and a lot of smaller events, more common, less extreme events. But then his point, kind of underlying that, seemed to be that he didn't believe for a moment that these mathematical models actually explained reality or financial marketplace reality in any case, but that they were ways to think about it.
right.
And ways to get a handle on it, but that basically, it's just too complex for us to understand. And I found that very refreshing, since it's kind of, the thing that strikes me sometimes about the universe when we really get to the ultimate questions, that, we have these wonderful tools that were very helpful, but, you can't, mistake the tool, or say you can't mistake the map for the reality. That old saw.
We're all
Map for the territory.
bozos on this bus.
Yeah, as the great philosopher put it.
Yeah, Mandelbrot. In End of Science, I quoted him saying in fractal geometry of nature, he's got this caveat where he says that in most cases he couldn't determine. It just turned out to be that this kind of fortuitous resemblance between these mathematical structures that he was interested in and certain natural phenomena or economic phenomena, or whatever. But he said the models it was extremely difficult to go from this mathematical resemblance to uncovering causes and effects, to really a deeper understanding of the system.
Well, yeah, that was kind of the whole major theme of chaos, that when you have these chaotic systems, they're simple at their core. There's like a simple algorithm that's generating this complexity, but untangling cause from effect is impossible, because it's this feedback loop. Recursion, so you can't untangle cause and effect in this artificial Newtonian kind of way, and you can describe and study, the macro behavior of the system, but it's always going to, just be kind of a handle on something that ultimately is mysterious.
Yeah, there's this, there's a field called, have you ever heard of the phrase Clio dynamics?
Clio? C-L-I-O?
So C-L-I-O, dynamics. So Clio is the muse of history. So I guess that's a Greek term. And Clio dynamics is this new buzzword that refers to these highly mathematical models of, for example, warfare or relations between nations, international events. And there are a few people who are trying to sort of they want this to be how history is done. So instead of history being this sort of storytelling, creating these compelling narratives, whether or not they actually reflect what's going on in the world, or what has gone on in the world, they say we need history to become more numerical, more like physics, or more like economics.
Yeah.
And there's a guy named, there's this group, Jack Goldstone, University of California, Davis, Daniel Esty, Yale University, and Ted Robert Gurr, who's at University of Maryland, who have, these are big guys in Clio dynamics, and they've created this gigantic database, and they are attempting to model the behavior of states so that they can predict civil wars and state collapse and things like this. And the CIA is apparently funneling a lot of money into this. And I think these guys need to talk to
to tell them.
to Lab. Yeah, because
if we can't model the mortgage securities market, maybe we're not going to be able to model international politics.
Yeah, God, modeling
relations.
the Middle East, modeling what's happening in
here's our
Pakistan
model of Kurdistan
right now. Right. Yeah.
Is Kurdistan extremistan or mediocristan?
Well, I mean, I hope these guys. I'm fascinated by this because it's obviously, I've said
fits in with your war thing.
Yeah, so I'd like to see war addressed as a scientific problem, and this is one way of doing that. I think you need to use every possible approach, but Jesus, here's where you really need humility. In sort of how you use your models.
Oh yeah, I mean this sounds great to me. This Clio Dynamics. I'm going to immediately go look at their website, but it's just as long as you don't mistake it for. You don't mistake your model for for your subject matter. It could be helpful, in trying to understand the past and history. And
I mean, how do you model psychotic leaders or just stupid leaders?
Yeah.
Or
I don't know, Monte Carlo
overconfident
simulations or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway,
and again, it would depend. You could model it if the anomalies were rare and were washed out by the what's the opposite of an anomaly? Anomaly? If the anomalies are rare and washed out by the anomalies, then you'd have a chance. But if it's something where if it's extremistan, where some vanishingly rare event is devastatingly destructive, which sort of seems to be the case.
I talked to that guy, the political scientist from Canada. I think his name is it's Homer Dixon Smith or Thomas Homer Dixon or God, I'm sorry, I forget his name. Anyway, there's Homer Dixon in the name somewhere, and he talked about the interconnectedness of modern life, which is so often touted as bringing us all these sorts of benefits, but that in these highly interconnected global systems, there is this tremendous capacity for volatility and crisis and catastrophic collapse.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's also a bigger capacity to absorb these things. So that's one thing that's going to be interesting to see with with the Wall Street collapse. I mean, now that we have this huge world economy kind of to take up the slack and absorb some of the perturbation, so maybe that's going to dampen it out sooner than it would have, saying, in the years of the Great Depression in the 1930s, when we were more of an insular economy, or at least the so-called Western world was fairly insular economically. Where now we have China buying most of our securities, but on the other hand, it could also lead to more volatility.
Yeah.
So we just don't know.
And then there's it's a psychological system. So what the government is trying to do right now is obviously intended to address a psychological problem.
Yeah, right.
Panic on the part of stockholders.
Yeah.
So
and more economists that are quoted in the papers today are saying, look, this is not going to do it. Well, maybe it'll temporarily slow down the inevitable, but so do we just let it crash and burn and get back to basics, or do we bail it out and start over again, and in a year or two I was reading some article somewhere that said the way you become rich is you've just got to find the next bubble and get on the bubble, get out just before it pops, and then don't invest ever again. So the whole question is, what will the next bubble be? Some guy wrote a book, I think, about bubble economies and how basically did Bob Bright talk to him, or was there a dialogue, Bubblenomics or something?
The tulip mania and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, just the fact that bubbles aren't anomalies, but this is basically the engine of the economy and the creator of economic wealth, and there's always going to be one bubble after another. And this other article that I read, this was months ago before all this really came down. I think it was in Harper's, and this guy was basically saying, just try to find the next bubble and get in on the ground floor. And